interesting event, which is organized by two of our MBA courses, the MBA Executive, and Professor Buradas, the director, is here, and by the MBA International. Professor Jan unfortunately was unable to attend. Unfortunately, this is a very bad day for Athens because, as probably some of you know, we have a strike in buses, in the metro, and on the other hand, a very heavy rain just started, which has made the traffic circulation extremely difficult. So more people are expected to arrive, hopefully. We are going to listen to some extremely interesting lectures by some very distinguished people whom I wish to thank for their participation in this event. And I wish you all a very interesting evening. I'm sure it will be. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening. I'm the coordinator of the event today. Before we start, I'd like to say a few things about our university. It may look very empty and grim at the moment, but this institution is very high in international rankings in both teaching and research. It is the oldest institution which teaches and does research in economics and business administration in Greece. And it was founded in 1920, a time of historic transition. And I think that it is, how can I say, a game of history that we are here today when Greece is going again through a historic period of transition and great turbulence. And Greece is trying to redefine its values. So it's very good that we're here today talking about the future of money. And I'd like, on behalf of our university, to thank all the distinguished guests who have come here at these difficult times to talk about such a fascinating topic. And of course, our thanks from the university to Professor Buradas, Professor Ioannou, and Nikos Karatsonis for having the courage to organize this event given the historical conjuncture. Now, before we start, I just would like to say that money, as an economic historian, I have to say something about history, and I believe that history should be linked with the future, or vice versa. Money is one of the most seminal innovations of mankind, and the questions that I would pose as a historian for the future are the following. Will it be a servant for social well-being or the master of values? Will money be a tool for the benefit of the many or for the profiteering of the few? We should not forget that money is a public good and that it is a force, or can be a force, for social cohesion. So thank you, and we'll start now with the presentation of Professor Bill Stone, best-selling author and award-winning documentary director, and please see him on YouTube. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, I'd love it if I was a professor, but I'm not. I'm just a reporter. That's all right. I just got onto a story that no one else knew about, no one else knew how to deal with. And so that's how I got started.
Well, independent scholars are very popular in my field. Casey will show always.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for coming today. The economic situation in Greece is not good, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. The solutions that have been offered are not working. We have assembled a group of world experts on the economy today to offer what we believe is the only solution for Greece. And we call this solution monetary reform. Monetary reform comes in a few variations, and you'll hear tonight about most of these different variations. However, the one thing that links all of us together is that the control of the quantity of money in Greece must be returned into the hands of the Greek people. Right now, how much money there is in Greece is determined by the European Union and the biggest banks in the form of loans. The voters of Greece have zero say in this, the most important power of the nation. In other words, the Greek people are no longer in control of their destiny. They have lost their democracy. So I realized this just yesterday how appropriate it is that we're here in Athens, the birthplace of democracy, discussing whether or not this cherished notion of human freedom through the democratic process can survive. So is self-government sustainable? Because there are only two choices in this world. Humanity can choose to struggle to remain free by electing representatives that will act in the public interest, or it must return to serfdom and collapse back into the law of the jungle. What is the law of the jungle? Political science has a name for it. It's called plutocracy. This is where the rich make all the rules, and those rules benefit them only. The rules are not made in the public interest. This violates the basic premise of all democracy, to do the most good for the most people. It seems to me, as an outsider, that plutocracy is now the case in Greece, certainly more so than democracy. So if Greece falls, which it surely will on its current course, then democracy itself will fail. And if democracy fails, then civilization itself will fail, and humanity will sink back into the Dark Ages. What is the most important characteristic of the march of humanity over the past 2,600 years, since the days of Solomon? What is the thing? What is this thing called civilization all about? It's all about the notion that we, the little people, can escape slavery only by banding together and forming a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. What does "of the people" really mean? It means that we, the people, have some say in how we are governed. That means that government must be fair. It must treat everyone equally. It means that everyone should have some say and have a fair chance to succeed. It means that effective government, by definition, must operate in the public interest. So does Greece actually have a government today that operates in the public interest? I believe the answer is no. I believe that we now have plutocracy, not democracy. I maintain that without the money power, without control over its money, Greece has lost the power of self-governance. I have a saying that I've repeated so many times over the past 30 years that others call a Stills axiom. Here's how it goes. It matters not what backs the money. All that matters is who controls the quantity. So, who controls the quantity of money in a nation is the most important power of a sovereign nation. So who controls the quantity of money now in Greece? Is it your parliament, your 300 elected representatives? No. Your parliament has zero control over the quantity of the national money. Control of the nation's money is the most important power of a sovereign nation. Without it, you are no longer sovereign because you can no longer control your destiny. Greece is now literally controlled by the European Union, which I call the beast of Brussels. Many in Greece feel that if they left the EU, that the loans would stop, and then the money would stop, and Greece would stall. Well, guess what? Greece is already starving. And one thing is for sure, if you do not get off this road, it will never get better, it will only get worse. Yes, the game is to pump up the Greek economy for the next few months to make it look like things may not get much worse. But that's only to get by the upcoming German elections. If Greece were to fail before those critical German elections in September, then the German people would likely elect a much more anti-EU group to its Bundestag. That would be a death blow to the EU, and their entire consolidation power game would come crashing down. Greece is being offered basically two paths: more loans and more austerity. Last week, the IMF approved more loans for Greece. Many here in Athens applaud this measure, but everyone knows that you cannot fix a debt problem with more debt. No more than you can solve an alcoholic problem with more alcohol. At some point, you have to stop living off borrowed money. So then the question is, when will it stop? The second path is called austerity, severe cuts in government spending. But will cuts in government spending raise GDP? No. Will it encourage national productivity? No. Will it encourage Greeks to become more independent, or will it encourage Greeks to become more dependent on imported products? Will it encourage Greeks to start manufacturing the products they need? Television sets, automobiles, computers? No. Will it encourage Greece to start manufacturing? Without internal manufacturing and food production, how will Greeks have goods to trade for petrol? No, neither of these two paths have any chance of working. They are both dead ends. They both feed only an economic death spiral. So why not get out? Try something that breaks you out of this death spiral of debt and dependency. Why not try something that is not some theory, not some idealistic dream? Why not try an economic system that has worked every single time it has been employed throughout world history? It means moving from a system of perpetual dependency back to a Greece being a proud, independent nation. So who am I talking about the roots of democracy here to you, the fathers and mothers of the entire democratic process? Just who do I think I am anyway? I started out life as a newspaper reporter in a small town in Virginia. So I was having a great time chasing small-time crooked politicians. When one day an old guy called me up on the telephone and said, "Boy, have I got a story for you. There's no gold left in Fort Knox." So I rolled my eyes and thought, another crazy person. When you run a newspaper, you get a lot of calls from crazy people, and they will literally suck every ounce of your time up if you let them. So I developed a system of getting them off the phone quickly and politely. That was, I would say, "That's great, send me something in the mail." Well, the crazy people would never have anything to send. I could immediately hang up and be off the phone in 30 seconds. But this guy wasn't a crazy person. In a couple of days, I got a thick packet of papers in the mail, and it turned out that at the end of World War II, 72% of world gold was stored in Fort Knox, the highest percentage of world gold ever collected at any time in world history. And to protect this great treasure, extraordinary measures were put in place to keep it safe. One of those measures was to have a physical audit of the gold reserves every year. Now, I don't know if you know what a physical audit is, but that's where gold bars would be randomly pulled from the rack, they'd be core bored, and the filings from that core boring would be assayed to be sure that you still had good deposit gold, which is 0.995 or greater in purity. But do you know when the last physical audit of the gold reserves in Fort Knox was performed? And remember, it's a federal law in the United States that it be performed every single year. Do you know when the last audit was actually performed? 1955. 58 years ago. So So as a reporter, I knew that the government was lying about something big, but I couldn't understand how all this fit into the world economic picture. But I got a sense that something big was going on. So I wrote my story as best I could, but I always knew that something else was going on, not the least of which was why in the heck have the big newspapers and TV channels in the United States jump on the story. Now, this is a reporter's dream. I really couldn't believe that this story was left to me, a little newspaper reporter, to take on this huge story. Incidentally, the History Channel finally called me up a year ago and asked me about this story, and they filmed a 1-hour piece which ran almost exactly a year ago. It was the first week in February of last year on the missing Fort Knox gold. I believe it's now available on the internet. It was on their H2 channel. Well, over the years, I finally figured out what was going on, and I wrote my first book on this topic in 1992. Then I produced my first documentary on the problem in 1996. It was called The Money Masters. The Money Masters has been wildly successful on the internet. The best guess we can come up with is that The Money Masters has been viewed over 100 million people in the last 17 years. It has consistently been ranked in the top 25 most popular documentaries of all times. Amazing for a 3.5-hour documentary on the economy. So let's take a brief look at the first 3 minutes of The Money Masters to see if it holds up. It was filmed 18 years ago. Take my word for it, it holds up pretty well. But I haven't figured out yet why my colleagues in the media had not picked up on this story. So a couple of years ago, I produced my second documentary on the money problem. It was called The Secret of Oz. It won Best Documentary of 2010 at one film festival and many other prizes at other film festivals. But still, I couldn't get any major media attention for the film, and I just could not understand why. It was a huge story. It affected every nation on the planet. It was the leading cause of most of the world's hunger, poverty, misery, and disease, for gosh sakes. And yet I could not get the major media interested in the story, and I just could not figure out why. Why was I so concerned about this? Well, naturally, it meant money to me. But beyond that, a free, independent press is an absolute necessity to the maintenance of the concept of democracy. So why weren't they interested? So when it was completed, I sent The Secret of Oz out to two of my oldest friends in the news business. They were now president and the #2 guy of one of the 3 leading networks in the United States. I'm not going to mention the name, but it's one of those 3. So a week later, the president of this network called me up and said they loved the film. I was shocked. I said, really? Why? So he explained that all the networks in the U.S. are all mortgaged out to the max. In other words, they've taken out as many loans as they possibly can in competition with each other. If one takes out some more loans, buys some new equipment, goes to HD, then all the others have to borrow also to go to HD to catch up. So it drives this borrowing frenzy. So they're all mortgaged out to the max. They're mortgaged to the point where they're absolutely dependent on JP Morgan coming in every year and rolling over the loans. They can't even afford to pay the interest. And if JP Morgan does not roll over the loans, they're out of business within a week. And that's what they're told, all the way down the line. So, in this last rollover cycle, JP Morgan guys came into the network and made the network lay off their top 100 executives. And that meant my friends got fired. So that's why they were mad. And they told me that's why I would never get on any of the networks talking about the evils of the debt money system. Not because JP Morgan actually owned the network, but because they effectively controlled all the networks by debt. And it's unspoken, but all the reporters know there's certain subjects you just don't go near. So it's the same with governments. When a government borrows, who is it borrowing from? Primarily from the biggest banks. So do you really think government is going to solve the debt problem when it is every day borrowing from the very lenders, the biggest banks? It's impossible. So step number one to fix this problem is to break the cycle of government borrowing. But we'll get into that later. So that's why we haven't heard anything about this debt problem as a major problem before. However, the Greek media is now interested because they see firsthand that the solutions being implemented are not working. So we are all here to point out the real roots of this problem. Although it never is mentioned in American history books, Americans have fought this debt monster throughout American history. For example, one of my favorite quotes is from the guy who wrote the biggest piece of the American Constitution, but his name is not one that most of you probably have ever heard. His name is Gouverneur Morris. In a letter to James Madison written on July 2nd, 1787, Morris explained the battle this way: "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did, they always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere if we do not, by the power of government, keep them in their proper spheres." Now notice what he's saying. He's not saying we need to steal from the rich. He's not saying we're going to take away all their money, we're going to throw them in jail, we're going to cut their heads off. None of that. Just we have to keep them in their proper spheres. They have a proper place in society. That they cannot turn a democracy into a plutocracy or a destroyed civilization. So the trick has always been to get a nation to borrow money because politicians quickly become dependent on the extra revenue from the loans. Why? Because the politicians can spend that money on their constituents to help get themselves reelected. It's a natural tendency, you can't avoid it. But they do not have to raise taxes because of the loans. They just push the repayment problem, the debt problem, down the road to another generation. So that's what is going on right now, not only in Greece, but in every nation. Politicians are easily convinced to accept loans instead of having to raise taxes. But the bad part is that these loans come with two prices. Number one, the interest payments on the debts are now climbing so quickly that they alone will bankrupt nearly every nation on earth. But that's not the worst of it. The second price is far more dangerous. It is the control that these debts bring. This control through debt is the very definition of plutocracy and is the very opposite of democracy. So Greece, if you want your democracy back, if you want your freedom back, you cannot just worry about the debt problem. Yes, think about this. You cannot fix the debt problem until you fix the borrowing problem. Nations should never be allowed to borrow. Why would a nation borrow when a nation can create? Would any of you borrow if you could create? It would be insanity. Last year I ran for the nomination of the third largest political party in the United States, the Libertarian Party, for the office of president. I'm not a politician by nature. I'm merely a reporter, but I felt that I was the only one on the political scene who understood these simple facts about the economic challenges every nation is now facing. So I took 6 months out of my life to raise the level of awareness on this issue. I can't run for office in Greece, but I pledge to help any candidate in Greece who understands the borrowing issue and runs for office with monetary reform as the primary objective. And all these various splintered parties throughout Greece, they all need to coalesce around this issue. And when they understand it, when I talk to Republican groups, they think I'm a Republican. When I talk to Democrat groups, they think I'm a Democrat. Because everybody understands this is the core issue. Returning again to U.S. history, it is always the goal of plutocracy to get the government to start borrowing, primarily from them. Thomas Jefferson explained the absurdity of how bankers took control of the American monetary system in 1815. The Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt bankers, pretending to have money whom it could have crushed at any moment. So what the heck was he talking about? Bold and bankrupt bankers pretending to have money. What does that mean? This refers to the second major problem with every national money supply in today's world. It's called fractional reserve lending. When you go down to your bank and you take out a loan, what the general public thinks is that the bank has a big vault of money that actually belongs to its depositors, and it takes some of that money out and loans it to you. That's the way it should be, but that's not the way it works in today's world. As soon as banks get governments to start borrowing, the first thing they do is to obtain from the government the right to leverage their reserves through fractional reserve lending. This means that if a bank has 1,000 euros in its vault, it gets to lend out 10,000 euros or more. Sometimes in Europe, 100 times. Where does it get the extra money? It just makes it up with a few clicks on the computer. It just makes it up. Once you understand this, there's a famous Henry Ford quote that if everyone in the United States understood how money was created, there'd be a revolution overnight. Others have said it's so simple that the mind reels because of its simplicity. You can't accept that this is true. Why? Because the media isn't telling you. We now know why. The politicians aren't telling you. We also know why. Who were the major funders of President Obama's campaign? The 12 top donors, they were all banks. Who were the top 6 donors of the Romney campaign? They were all big banks. So, let's look at the example of when the first bank of the United States was formed in 1791, just 2 years after the U.S. Constitution became the supreme law of the land, to understand what Jefferson was talking about. Like all privately owned central banks that would follow, the new bank was given a name that would deceive people into thinking that it was part of the government. Now, why the heck is that so important? Because if you go out on the street and you ask the average person in Athens right now, who creates the money? They'll say the government does. Why do they say that? Because intuitively they know that's the way it should be. Why would you give this monopoly power over to counterfeiters to use strictly for their benefit? It just doesn't make sense. It was called the First Bank of the United States. After a contentious debate, Congress granted the new bank a 20-year charter, a private monopoly. And I'm so sorry to hear that the Bank of Greece was just granted a new 50-year charter last week. Sorry we couldn't have done something about that. The nation's money would be created out of thin air by the new bank and loaned to the government and to private individuals, all at interest, just as our money supply is created today. So if there was $1 million worth of money in the economy, there would be $1 million worth of national debt. Debt the citizens and their children would have to pay interest on by taxation. And so it is today. The national debt is roughly the same as the national money supply. How did this bank get its start of capital? Well, that's a funny story. The bank needed $10 million to get started. So the U.S. government was given 20% of the shares in the bank, and they put up immediately $2 million worth of cash. Where did the rest of the money come from? The bankers loaned that $2 million through the magic of fractional reserve lending to each other to buy the remaining 8% of the shares. In other words, they put up no cash themselves. They just loaned each other the money created by the new bank out of thin air to sell each other the stock of the bank, a risk-free investment if there ever was one. The plan was backed by Alexander Hamilton, who called national debt a national blessing. But I say national blessing to whom? Within the first year year of the founding of the first bank of the U.S., inflation surged. Thomas Jefferson, the nation's first Secretary of State, said this about the first bank of the United States. As the doctrine it is that a public debt is a public blessing, so they think a perpetual one is a perpetual blessing, and therefore wish to make it, the debt, so large that we can never pay it off. Within 5 years, the federal government owed $6.2 million to the first Bank of the United States. The entire U.S. budget for 1796 was only $5.9 million. During this period, prices had inflated by 72%. So when its charter expired in 1811, Congress did not renew it, and so thankfully it died. But just 6 years later, a sufficient number of congressmen had been bribed so that a new privately owned central bank was voted another 20-year charter, and it was called the Second Bank of the United States. The same rules applied. The government put up the money, and the bankers loaned each other the money to purchase the remaining 80% of the shares in the bank. Please note that all this was clearly a private corporation, just as the Federal Reserve System today is a private corporation. It was clearly a private corporation because it sold the government 20% of the stock. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, he was determined to kill the Second Bank of the U.S. That's Jackson fighting the dragon, the multi-headed dragon. And although it took him until 1836 to do it, almost his entire 2 terms as president, he eventually killed it. Then Jackson paid off the national debt, the only U.S. president to do so. So down through the years, this battle has raged in the U.S. Control of the American monetary system has changed hands 7 times back and forth between control by the government or control by a privately owned central bank disguised as a government bank. I document this in my book, No More National Debt. So what should we do at this point? Monetary reform rests on 2 great pillars: no more national debt and no more fractional reserve lending. Banks should only be able to lend out money they actually have. So what does this mean for Greece? If Greece can no longer borrow money, what can it do? Will it fall into the sea? Will its citizens starve en masse? Simple. Just do as nations throughout world history have done, including Greece during the time of Solomon. Create the money you need and create it without debt. Don't borrow. In other words, start printing the drachma again. The government can then spend drachma into existence and pay workers for infrastructure projects, pay social programs, etc. What about Greek debt? There are several schools of thought here. You can either renounce it, not pay it at all, or you can pay it off in a new drachma, or you can only pay part of it, known as a haircut. These things would have to be decided on by the Greek people after careful debate with considering the consequences for each alternative. But you may ask, why would another nation or foreign bank accept payments of its debts in drachma, especially when the EU Charter specifically forbids repayment in anything but euros? Well, Greece could tell its creditors, take our drachma or get nothing. Of course, the bankers would threaten and attack any way they could. The drachma would become devalued. But what does that mean for the average Greek person in the streets? It would mean that you could no longer import BMWs from Germany. Would that be too bad? What if it stimulated Greek entrepreneurs to start making their own BMWs or their own Greek cars here in Germany? But there's another question, that is of petrol. I take it that Greece has to import almost all of its oil, so this is a problem. But I said at the start, as Greek internal production started increasing, If Greek imports were near zero, then your balance of trade would be a huge positive number, and you could afford to buy the petrol you need. Look at it this way. Greece is going to have to suffer horribly one way or another. If you stick with the EU, IMF, ECB loans, you will suffer more and more every year. It will never get better. At least this way, your suffering would only last for a year or two. Then you would be free, strong, independent once again. Again, the bankers will do everything in their power to stop you. Here's an example of the threats they made to Iceland. When the crisis first broke out in 2008, the Icelandic parliament was given a plan by the IMF to restructure their debts. They did not want to approve it. The parliament did not. According to a friend of mine, Icelandic parliamentarian Birgitta Jónsdóttir, the IMF representatives threatened the island by telling the parliament, you only have 3 weeks of food left on the island. If you don't take our deal, we will move to ban food imports from Europe, and your country and your nation will starve. This was a serious threat to parliamentarians. Iceland doesn't have many food resources, only fish. So the parliament voted for the plan initially. But then the Icelandic people became outraged. They surrounded the president's house with 10,000 Hawi flares. That's an actual picture of it. The president suddenly decided he was not going to sign the bill into law. He decided to put it to a vote, a referendum. So what happened? The Icelandic people voted down the IMF plan by a 92-8 margin. A stunning defeat. A year later, the IMF came back with a new, less horrible plan. It too was put to a vote. The day before the vote, the Wall Street Journal opined in its pages that if the people of Iceland did not vote for this new plan, they would never be able to borrow again. Check it out. So what happened? Of course, I would say, great idea if you don't get to borrow again. But it was scary. They had no idea what was going to happen. So how did it turn out? The people voted again against the new plan by a 60-40 margin. Then what happened just 3 months later? The IMF came banging on the parliament's door, begging them to take out new loans. So you see, their power is addicting a nation to debt. That is the root of their power. If a nation escapes, it is very bad for their business, the business of control. So these guys are all bluff. If you, as a proud Greek nation, just do the right thing to restore democracy in your country, the people of the world will unite behind you. Then all nations will follow in your footsteps and break the back of this debt money monster once and for all. Lastly, I just want to encourage you that the plutocrat's most effective trick is to convince you, the average person, that this money problem is way too complicated for you to possibly comprehend, much less try to fix. I tell you that this is not complicated. You can understand this. You can figure it out, and you can do something about it. In fact, you must figure it out if you're going to survive. You must insist that your politicians tackle this problem of borrowing and fractional reserve lending head on. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Phil. And now I'd like to invite the second speaker tonight, Professor Huber from the University of Martin Luther, Germany. And he will talk to us about creating a fair monetary system, the case for plain sovereign currency. Thank you.
Thank you for the welcome, and good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you on certain aspects of our monetary system, such as it stands today, and on monetary reform. I will start with a brief analysis of what Bill Still already has mentioned as today's system of fractional reserve banking, and thereafter I will talk on monetary reform. Now, you may have come across these numbers here. Interestingly, that was a study carried out on behalf of the National Monetary Fund, and they found out that from 1970 through to 2007, run up to the present crisis, there were actually more than 400 systemic financial crises across the world. Banking crisis, currency crisis, and sovereign debt crisis. And so this is proof enough to understand that there is something wrong with the monetary system. If it continually creates crisis after crisis on migrating hotspots across the world. So it seems from an empirical and practical point of view, it doesn't work. It's stumbling from one crisis to the next one. I mean, there have many causes, many reasons being identified why we have this crisis and how it came about and so on. But there is one cause missing. There's one cause that has not been given due attention, and that's the monetary system. So, and in my analysis, or I should say in our analysis, the analysis shared by most of the monetary reforms today, fundamental cause and reason, so to say, that's the monetary system. The monetary system actually can be seen as to be the cause of causes, so to say, the cause of the monetary cause of all of those financial crises. And the basic problem is overshooting money supplies, is overshooting, derailing credit creation, debt creation, which is in the present system equals creation of money, of bank money, of demand deposits on current account. And how it is done? I mean, it's a simple, money is fiat money and is created out of nothing. So the original form of today's money is no longer, say, a currency in the sense of coin and banknotes. Money comes into existence as an entry, a scriptural entry into the current account. That's the original form of money today, and then maybe that coin or banknotes are exchanged out of and back into that non-cash money supply. And banks always create money when they make out credit in one form or another. The normal way it happens is known to us, for example, when we actually an overdraft in our current account. Then we create new money. And that money didn't exist before. It's not the bank doesn't have the money, and we are asking for the credit, and then the bank hands over the money to us. That's not the way it works. The money doesn't exist. And then we ask to have money, we activate an overdraft, and in that moment, uno acto, by the same act, we create that money. So credit creation is debt creation is money creation. And it happens when banks make up credit, but it also happens when they purchase assets, such as bonds, government bonds particularly, or stocks, or real estate and similar things. And maybe that, so textbook wisdom has it, and actually most experts believe that today's central banks, even if the commercial banks create the lion's share of the money, they still believe that central banks can control what banks are doing, can control credit creation by banks. For example, by minimum reserves or by setting interest rates and so on. And again, this is not the way how it works. The initiative is with banks. Banks decide on whether or not to create or not to create money. And so that's in the beginning, that's the first step. What central banks do today is they react, they refinance, and only residually. And in the European Monetary Union, actually, in order to create 100 euros, the banking sector today needs just 2.5 to 3% in central bank money. And this 2.5% consists of 1.4% cash for the teller machine and just 0.1% in operational balances in central bank credits bank in the central bank account, and in addition 1% obligatory minimum reserve, and that's all. And so I have never heard that central banks would have refused to refinance banks. They may demand a higher or lower interest rate for making out credit to banks, but banks are never refused the money they want to have. They need residually, just they need to refinance just 2.5%. That's important to know. And so here we see over 100 years, or the last century, how the share of bank money, the share of demand deposits, society deposits, and current account, how that developed. You had an increase to the run-up to the Great Depression, and then there were a number of decades to the sideways movement, and then again, particularly marked since around 1980. Then again, there was another takeoff in the creation of bank money, and actually in disproportionate creation of bank money. And you may wonder how it works. I mean, how is it possible that banks can do this? Well, simply because we actually use demand deposits in our current accounts as if it were money in the sense of sovereign money, sovereign coin, or sovereign banknotes or so. But it's just bank money, and it's money surrogate. It's still called the money surrogate. It's quasi money, but it's the most important mix of money we use it. I mean, we like it because so it's convenient, and that's life. And how does it work? So that interaction between the fractional money base and the bank money, and there is one, say, trick, so to say. It's very easy to understand. Over the course of the day, it's the system of overnight or day-to-day clearing and settlement. And in this example here, you can see that we have two banks, and it means that there are, over the day, there are payments, outgoing payments from customers of the banks and from the bank itself going out to other addresses. And in the other direction, there are payments, incoming payments. So, and in the end of the day, a large volume of payments has been carried out, or has been initiated. In this case, 90,000, and in the other direction, 85,000. And what has to be settled in central bank money is just 5,000, and not even that, because most banks have bilateral interbank clearing systems. They have a swing, so to say, an interbank overdraft, an interbank swing, which also equally allows banks to avoid having to make payments in central bank reserves. And that's really important. And yeah. So what I want to show you here is started to derail in the sense of becoming ever more disproportionate, ever more disproportionate in comparison to GDP, to the growth of GDP. And in the European Monetary Union, so the disproportionate growth, so the money supply doubled, but GDP did, of course, did not. Particularly marked it was in Germany, where you can see here that until around 1980, by the way, in the United States it's completely the same picture. It's almost identical in the United States. Until around 1980, you had the cycles movement, which meant that the money supply and economic growth as measured by GDP developed in step. So, I mean, there is an increase in the money supply, but that was in step with economic growth. And from around 1980 onwards, we had the disproportionate growth of the money supply. Here you see in the European Monetary Union, from 1995 to 2008, we had an increase in the money supply of about 109%, but real GDP was just 23%. And nominal GDP, which includes consumer price inflation, was at about 50%. What is the meaning of it? What does this say, these figures? It says that only 1/8 of the increase in the money supply went into real economic growth. Another 1/8 went into consumer price inflation. What is it with the rest, with the remaining 6/8 or 3/4 of the increase in the money supply, in the addition to the money supply? Where did it go to? Well, it went into another kind of inflation. It went into asset inflation. That's the only explanation I know of. And there are two main channels through which credit and debt creation, or the expansion of bank balance sheets, how this contributes to the creation of financial asset bubbles. And one is direct leverage of financial market investment, and the other one, the other very important one, is funding public debt. Whenever governments go in debt, and it's funded by the private commercial banking sector, by conglomerates, and that's two main channels. This is the very robust money supply inflation thing, and that's more important for us today. Here again, you see the relation of, in the case of the United States, of financial assets as a proportion of GDP. And here again, you see how until around 1980, there was a development growth, so to say, in step, but from that moment on, it started to derail. And that can clearly be seen here in this chart. And now the question is, when you are building up, financial assets, it's equal to create debt. Who goes in debt? Who are the ones who went in debt? Well, what you can see here is the red brown sector, that's the financial businesses themselves, the monetary and financial institutions among themselves, in order to create leverage for financial market investments. They went in debt. And the other debtor, of course, are governments across the industrial world. Over-indebtedness of governments nowadays is a general problem, and it is a problem in Japan, and it's a problem in the United States, and it's a problem in the United Kingdom, it's a problem everywhere, Germany, France, and Netherlands. And there are only a few countries where it's not that serious problem, for example, Switzerland, or there are a couple of very few countries. All other countries went to debt, and it's important to know who is the owner of the debt, which is equal to saying who is the beneficiary of the debt. And it's important, it's not human need, not you. But it's important to know that the main beneficiaries of the entire game are again blue gas banks. The banks and the shadow banks, and the European Union is actually about 50 to 60% of the government bills and bonds are held by commercial banks, and another third is held by shadow banks, by various types of funds and also by insurance companies, and only the rest, depending on the country, of about 7 to 16% is in private hands, so to say, in the hands of private households. At the same time, this creates a very problematic shift in income distribution, because the problem is that if the share of financial assets is growing so disproportionate in comparison to GDP, what does it mean? It means that you see all payments, all accruing income over the year has to be paid out of current GDP. So it has to be paid out of the proceeds of current GDP or by additional debt. What it means is when financial assets are growing disproportionately, it means that an ever-growing share of current income has to be paid on financial incomes at the expense of earned income. And so that creates a shift from earned income to financial income. And that's very problematic all the time. 10, 20, 30 years is enough to create an extreme unbalance and to create a situation in which, as the saying goes, the rich are growing richer and the poor are poorer. We actually are in such a situation today, in spite of welfare state and everything. This is the decline of pension income. Now, which is that the financial causes of the crisis have become a monetary cause, the monetary system such as it stands today. And so you can say that if you start from such a view, you can say that for sorting out banking and financial markets, one has to come to grips with the monetary system first. Now, what does it mean now to come to grips with the monetary system? Well, it basically means what Bill Still already has said. And the most important thing is to obtain control of the money. That's what went wrong. The sovereigns have lost control of the money. So the control has ceded to the private banking sector. That's a fundamental problem. And so the main general goal of any monetary reform you can conceive of always will be and must be to regain control, to obtain full control of the money, which means of the money supply, the quantity of the money supply. And once you have that, of course, at the same time you have control of inflationary factors as far as they are due to monetary variables. So that's obtaining control of the money and the money supply at the same time means obtaining control of consumer price inflation and asset inflation as far as I said this is due to monetary factors. So the most important task would be to reintroduce sovereign money or sovereign currency in the sense, also including non-cash money. So currency in the sense, China regular means of payment in the national or international setting. Sovereign money means it is, to put it briefly, state money or state-controlled money. It's not private banking money. That's the important thing. So, and this is when you look at it from a legal point of view or from a constitutional point of view, from the point of view of constitutional law, it means to re-establish the monetary prerogative as a sovereign right of constitutional importance. And it's in one of the same importance as, for example, the state monopolies on legislation or jurisdiction of taxation and also the use of force. The monetary prerogative is of the same importance. So that implies to do away with private bank money. I mean, banks will have to, banks should and must, of course, be able to continue their business. But what's their business? Their business is not to create money. It's not to provide people with money. That's government's business or a public central bank's business or a business of a central bank under public law. Banking business is to finance activities. Banking business is to credit, to organize for loans, and to organize for certain investment banking activities and so on. They should be free enterprises on free markets and so on. But what they should not be allowed is, in addition, to create themselves the money they need for carrying out their business. There must be some sort of separation of functions or separation of powers. And so creating the money and providing the money the nation needs, that's a public task of utmost importance. And it needs to be in the hands of some sort of public body, some sort of public monetary authority. And then once you have introduced that kind of separation of powers, things will be different. And monetary reform actually means restoring monetary sovereignty in the right, in the sense of it includes three elements. The first element is to determine the currency of the real, the unit of account in a nation. Whereby, personally, I mean, can be a community of nations. It's not necessarily one single nation, but it can be a community of nations, but they can, as a community, they must have the right to determine the unit of account in their territory. But the second is that what has seen to the banks. The second is to create or issue the money denominated in that unit of account, and last but not least, obtaining the seigniorage. The seigniorage is the term for the profit which accrues from creating the money. It can have two forms. It can be interest-born when you issue the money in the form of credit, when you are loaning the money into circulation. You will have an interest-born seigniorage, but you can spend that free. You can spend, the sovereign who creates the money can spend the money into circulation debt free, free of interest and without specified maturity. And that's genuine seigniorage, so to say. And it's important, seigniorage today, that's as I think, an illegitimate privilege of the banks. And actually, it's a sovereign right, and it should be restored to the nation to whom it belongs. So that the entire seigniorage, that the public purse can benefit from the whole of the seigniorage created. And that includes setting up an independent monetary authority that is responsible for the money, and it, as I said already, includes normal bank money. Now, this is not an individual idea of mine, but there is now, one can actually say in the meantime, a kind of a new social movement has been forming during the last years across the industrial world, a new monetary movement, a movement in favor of monetary reform. I have written here, I have made a list of a number of organizations in Europe, America. There are also groups in Japan who stand up for monetary reform. And now to come to an end, I will say a few words on the advantages. But that will begin with the disadvantages. We have tried very, very hard to find disadvantage what a transition from private bank money to plain sovereign money could involve. And we did not find, we tried hard, but we did not find a disadvantage, a general disadvantage that would bring about. There is, of course, one important disadvantage seen from the banking point of view. If you are a bank, you are going to lose a number of privileges, and you are going to lose a certain percentage of the profits you have been accustomed to. So that's, of course, from the banking point of view, a huge disadvantage. So, but for the rest of the institutions and people, for the public purse, for the state budgets, and for the real economy, and for the people in the private households, that would be a blessing, actually. And so the list of advantages starts with saying that as far as the present money system has its advantages, all of these advantages can be kept. So, for example, such a reform does not involve a revolution in a certain sense of upheaval and turning things upside down. Not at all. Most institutions can stay in place, and banking practices can more or less remain unchanged and so on. And there will always be sufficient money, of course. Modern money anyway is created out of nothing. It's fiat money. So the coverage of money is not in the other type of money. The coverage of money is in economic productivity. That's the coverage of the backing of our money, the backing of purchasing power. It's not in another type of money. So there will always be sufficient money, no scarcity in money supply, and also flexible money supply, which is only a partial reality today, affordability of credit, maturity transformation, which means borrowing money short term and lending it for long term, and all of these things can be done in a system of sovereign money, much as it could be done or can be done in the present system. Further advantages, so these new structural advantages of the transition from bank money to sovereign money involves the following in the 5 points. The first is money would be safe. It could no longer disappear. Today in a bank run, your money on account can disappear. There are, of course, certain deposit insurance schemes and so on, but in a true banking crisis, that's how one bank on it. There is not enough money in it. It won't work. So in a true bank run, a systemic bank run, our money will be lost as it was ever lost before throughout the last 2 or 3 centuries. Sovereign money on account can no longer disappear because it's no longer a credit or a debt. It's money such as kind of banknotes we have in our wallet or in the portemonnaie. So there can be crises, severe crises, but the money I had cannot disappear. So that's one of the first advantage. Now, second and third is that once the money supply is under control, once it's no longer, say, a process out of control. I mean, the banking doctrine has it that the money supply controls itself because it is supposed that monetary and financial markets are efficient, as the saying goes. But how can markets be efficient if there is no scarcity at all? If banks can, at will, can create as much money as they like. There can be no market equilibrium. Already the banking school of the 1830s and 40s maintained that monetary markets would regulate themselves. There can be no overshooting money supply. It's simply impossible because there is a regulating hand. So God's mons gubernatorius, the invisible hand of the markets and so on. So that's purely fictional. There is no equilibrium. The experience shows that monetary markets and also financial markets do not find some stage of equilibrium as long as there is an unlimited supply of money, an unlimited possibility for commercial banks to create new money, new the stock of money already in place. And once you have the money and the quantity of the money under control, you can, so that's the most important factor for controlling inflation and for controlling asset inflation. And last but not least, points 4 and 5, that's the end of my contribution. It's the huge benefits for public purse that can be derived from sovereign money. And at first advantage would be that regularly, year after year, in addition to the stock of money, in line with economic growth, that would relieve public budgets. That it could be a replacement for taxes. And the second very important advantage today, as we are in the midst of a severe sovereign debt crisis, there will be a one-off seigniorage only once. And this comes through the transition. The transition itself creates a one-off seigniorage because the stock of demand deposits in place will have to be phased out in the course of, say, 2 to 4 years' time, depending on how much credit is still outstanding. So, and it will take 2 to 4 to 5 years for that money to be phased out, and at the same time it has to be replaced, because we do not want to see an extreme shrinkage of money. So the bank money that is being phased out will have to be replaced by sovereign money of a comparable amount, and that creates that one-off transition seigniorage. And to give you an idea of how much money that would be, according to today's dimensions, basic idea is that, as was the case until around 1980, that the money supply would by and large, not exactly but grosso modo, would have to grow more or less in line with the real economic growth and the growth of the potential of economic capacity, so to say. So that you can say that by and large, 1 percentage point increase in GDP that would induce a 1 percentage point increase in the money supply, more or less. And with regard to Greece, that would mean that the real money supply today, which is accounted in the aggregate, in the monetary aggregate on one, is close to 100 billion euros. And if that is to increase 1%, 2%, and so on, that would mean that seigniorage would be on an order of 1 or 2 or 3 billion of euros, which could be completely debt-free, basically. Money that does not need to have been borrowed, and citizens would not have to pay taxes for that. But it could be a substitute for taxes to that extent. When it sounds not that much. 1 billion today. We are getting used to have bigger numbers or so. But it's actually much money which is at stake, and the proportion is similar in different countries. In Switzerland, the situation is of course the best. It's always the best. They could replace about 2.5 up to 6.5% of their entire public budget. It's not only the central state, it's also the regions and the municipalities and other bodies like public law. So that's much money that would help to balance the budgets. And here, the last figure, if you have a look at the fourth line here, Greece in 1011. this list is a couple of items that would have to be included in such an account. It's the customer demand deposits, interbank demand deposits, and the reserve banks and the central bank. That would have to be replaced by Sinrich money, creating Sinrich, that would have to be replaced by sovereign money or sovereign currency, creating genuine Sinrich. And in Greece, it would have been in the year 11, it would have been about 95 billion euros, and total public debt of Greece at that time was at 280 billion euros. And so you can say that by, in a very smooth way, you could replace about 1/3 of the entire public debt in Greece. And Greece, together with Japan, is the nation state today with the biggest, relatively the biggest public debt. In other nations, the percentage that could be wiped out, so to say, through monetary reform would be slightly larger than even a reduction of Greek debt by 1/3. That would be a very, 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 very important relief, and we would have a completely different situation, and we wouldn't have a debt crisis any longer. And that can be obtained without massive things, without having a revolution, without turning things upside down, without haircuts, I want to say, without haircuts for creditors, which are otherwise unavoidable, and without, which is the most important, without austerity regimes for the people. You can avoid unemployment, you can avoid austerity, you can avoid impoverishment, and you can even avoid haircuts to the creditors through such a monetary reform. And things being that, I do not understand why experts in our governments do not actually embrace this opportunity, or at least take it into consideration. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite our third speaker, Professor Werner, who will talk to us on the topic of solution to the European crisis and how to avoid making the debt crisis grow. I'd like to add that Professor Werner is based at the University of Southampton, and that he has two very well-known
Thank you for this opportunity to speak here. Many thanks to the organizers who've put together this conference in record time. And thanks to you who braved both bad weather and the transport situation to attend here. Solutions for Greece. There are solutions. And I'm not going to talk about the, of course, also existing real solutions of default, euro exit, and giving up national sovereignty. These are sort of the options that are debated. On the one hand, the EU, ECB are effectively demanding and have partly already received the transfer of sovereignty from Greece. So that's what's been happening. And opponents say, well, no, we shouldn't do that. Euro exit or default are options, we can do it. It's true, these are options, and Greece could implement them. But because sometimes the debate is so, these two extremes, perhaps it's easier for many people to go for options that also exist in between, and I want to introduce those. How did Greece actually get into trouble? Well, of course we know where it all started. That was when Greece gave up control over its money, such as by joining the euro. And of course, since then, the ECB has been making monetary policy for Greece. Before, it was the Bank of Greece that made monetary policy, although it's of course also an open question who the Bank of Greece made monetary policy for. Let's look at the following question. What sort of monetary policy has been pursued? To answer that question, we need to quickly think about, well, how can we actually measure, evaluate monetary policy? And to answer that question, we need to ask a more fundamental one. Actually, what is money? How do we measure money? Those of you who've studied economics or finance or banking will know what the textbooks say. The textbooks say, it's really much harder to measure money than one would have first thought. And we're not going to really tell you, because we don't know. There's another mainstream textbook that says, there is widespread agreement among economists that money is important, but they've never agreed on how to define it and how to measure it, which is true. And the Federal Reserve, surely the experts, they should be able to tell us what money is and how to measure it. Well, they say there is no definitive answer to the question, what is money? Is it really that complicated? Of course, this is a way of preventing debate and right at the outset, right at the start. Nobody can measure money, so can't really discuss money. Well, let's shift the question. Return to money. What about banks? We all know when we talk about money, the topic of banks will soon come up. We know, what do the textbooks say? The banks are supposedly just intermediaries. So on the right-hand side, you've got the savers, that's you and me, and companies putting out money, putting it into the bank. The bank takes the money and lends it out for investment to investors. And so the banks are just intermediaries. In fact, very safe intermediaries, we're being told. This reserve requirement exists in many countries, not all. But in many countries, it's usually very small, 1%. So the banks receive deposits with 1% reserve, 99% is lent out, and 1% is put aside. Very safe, these banks, aren't they? You know, I mean, a fund, an investment fund, if you put money in there, they will try to invest 100%. Well, they actually do keep a cash ratio, but there's no formal reserve kept outside the fund. So it would appear these banks are safe intermediaries. Yet, of course, we all know we have recurring, frequent banking crises in the last 50 years. We've had more than 100 banking crises. So something can't be quite right about the story of the safe banks as intermediaries. And empirically, the evidence has been out there for a long time, also in the academic literature. Just to mention two papers, there's a longer list. Papers that have shown there is something about banks that makes them special. The mainstream neoclassical finance expert Farmer argues that they must have some kind of monopoly power. But he's not telling us what that is. Likewise, Ashcroft of the Federal Reserve System have demonstrated in a detailed empirical study that banks are special in the financial system because whenever you close a bank, a local bank, America has many banks, even before the crisis, a few will be closed per year. And you can demonstrate that this clearly has a measurable negative impact on the economy. That's not supposed to happen when markets are efficient. Banks are just intermediaries. You switch off the intermediary, there are other intermediaries. How come it has a significant negative impact? So clearly there's something about banks that makes them special. Economic theory didn't tell us why. And of course, Bill and also Professor Huber have already told you what the answer is. And the answer is the question, where does money come from? I did a poll, and majority of the money supply comes from. Over 80% responded the government, the central bank, surely. I also asked another question in that poll, further down. Would you agree to a system whereby the majority of the money supply is created and allocated by usually profit-oriented enterprises? And over 90% responded, no, are you crazy? So the impression I had reading was an extremely strong result. Of course, that explains the question why we don't read about this in the textbooks and in the media. Because the answer is, as you know, only 3% of the money supply is created by the central bank. 97%, virtually all of it, is created by the banks, usually profit-oriented enterprises. And this system is one that the public would not agree with if they knew about it. That's why we don't hear much about it. So banks have the license to create money out of nothing. Professor Huber has already shown you the balance sheet. Just perhaps another way of looking at this, if you want to look at it from the reserve requirement perspective, if a bank gets a new deposit of 100, according to the reserve requirement story, they lend out 99, they put €1 or dollar into the central bank. But actually, of course, they don't have to do that. They will take the entire 100, and they could put it with the central bank and say, well, that's my 1% out of 10,000. So now we can lend 10,000 minus the 100, 9,900. And how's that? Well, the loan contract, once you've signed it, is the basis on which the bank will write on their balance sheet a claim on you because you'll repay the money. And you'll say, I don't care about the accounting, give me the money. And they will say, we've just opened an account for you with us. You'll find it in there. They may say, we'll transfer it there. That's not true. The key is, no money is transferred into your account. So it's created out of nothing. And of course, that is the credit creation. Now, some of you may think, well, what Bill is saying, or what Professor Huber or this Bernard Kahn is saying, some theories perhaps, surely this can't be true. Well, check for yourselves. Central banks are actually on the record of admitting this, usually in obscure places, very rarely in their main speeches or the main policy documents, and never has it been a factor in the formulation of their official policies. But they are on the record. The Federal Reserve has said it. The process of money creation takes place primarily in banks. The Bank of England has said it recently, more often actually than usual. The money supply is created by the banks. When banks make loans, they create additional deposits. The ECB has said it, banknotes and commercial bank money are interchangeable payment media. Bundesbank said it, banks create money. Money is created primarily by the extension of credit. So it's a fact, and the story is wrong. Now, we have to be aware of the power banks therefore have. They control, as Bill was pointing out, the quantity of money. And also, the quality of the use, in other words, the allocation, who gets the money. And that decision will reshape the entire economic landscape in any country within a few years. That is a very important decision. And it's not made by democratic vote, by parliament, by government. It's not even made by some independent council considering the pros and cons and costs and benefits. No. It's made by usually profit-oriented enterprises that have only been told, you go out and maximize profits, which usually means short-term profits. But it's a decision that affects us all. Of course, that's how Greece got into trouble. As I show in my quantity theory of credit, you can separate the money supply and you define it properly because it's credit creation into the two streams: credit used for GDP transactions and credit used for non-GDP transactions, which is financial transactions, asset transactions, property transactions. And there's a reason why these transactions are not in GDP. GDP, the way it's defined, has many problems, but it was decided to measure some form of value added. That's of course why speculative transactions aren't in there. There's no value added. It's a zero-sum game. But when you link that to money creation, when banks create money for speculators to use that and use for financial transactions, you're starting a Ponzi game, Ponzi scheme, whereby the banks create this money for speculation. If you create money and inject it into asset markets, what will happen with asset prices? They will rise, of course. And everyone seems to be making money, but it's clear from the outset that this is unsustainable and cannot be in aggregate paid back. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's, it's the game with the music, and when the music stops, you take away the chairs, musical chairs. Everyone has to sit down, but one chair is missing. That's what it is, of course. And as the bankers sometimes even say on the record, the music is playing, we have to dance. We're still dancing. But when the music stops, then there have to be bankruptcies, because credit creation for financial transactions in aggregate cannot be paid back because there is no fundamental income stream that's generating enough money to service and repay the principal. So we know that from the outset. And of course, therefore, when we disaggregate credit, we can also demonstrate this and how this affects markets. We can use it to forecast what's happening in countries, what will happen in countries. So here on the left chart, you see credit creation for GDP transactions, explaining nominal GDP for Japan in the 80s and 90s, which no other economic model can explain. This was all the puzzle and the mystery according to standard models. Credit, disaggregated credit, can explain hands down. And of course, you can explain asset markets. They talk about bubble, irrational markets, CAPM, all the asset pricing models fail. Well, just look at credit for financial transactions and you can explain asset prices. In Japan, the bubble of the 70s and of course of the 80s and the contraction. There's a fundamental rule, therefore, with credit creation. When credit is created, money is created and used for productive purposes, generating products, goods and services, or increasing productivity in a wide sense, enhancing quality of life is broadly defined productivity increase, or making the economy more environmentally friendly. Then you get growth without inflation, even when you have full employment. Obviously, we're pretty far away from that increase at the moment. This is the good credit creation. Then there are two major types of bad credit creation. When you create credit, banks give loans and it's used for consumption. It's very clear. You increase the money supply, the demand for things, goods and services through consumer loans, but you have the same amount of goods and services. So of course you must get consumer price inflation. That's perhaps more widely understood, but what has been neglected is being credit for financial transactions. And of course that creates asset inflation. And so these types of uncorrected credit creation should be banned, basically stopped, or at least slowed and only targeted in exceptional cases. Because whenever credit for financial transactions rises, you get asset bubbles. In Japan, for example, the graph here shows the share of financial credit to total credit doubling from 15 to 30%, while the total also was rising tremendously. But it's the same in any financial bubble, whether it's the 1920s in the US or the 80s in Scandinavia and Japan, or indeed many European countries such as Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece in the 2000s, from 2003 onwards in particular. So whenever broad credit growth, which is money supply growth, rises faster than nominal GDP, you know by definition it can't have been credit for GDP transactions, it must have been credit for financial transactions. Therefore, you know a bubble is being created when you see this like here in Japan in the 80s, credit growth of between 10 and 15%, GDP growth of 4 to 5%. And the same is true for Ireland, where it was clear from 2003 onwards, with credit growth growing between, well, around 30% at the peak, and also Spain, 15% credit growth. So what about Greece? Remember, one of the questions was, monetary policy is not made by Parliament, not by the government, it's made by the central bank. So what kind of monetary policy has been made for Greece? Because the central bank is the player that has responsibility for keeping bank money creation in check. They have tools. They can decide to let the bankers play however way they wish, or they can decide to rein in credit creation, even allocate credit, as has happened in East Asia quite successfully. So what have they done in Greece? Here we've got a chart. Just look at the black line. The black line is bank credit growth. And you see that particularly from 1993, 1994 onwards, until 2008, when it was released today, things were getting out of hand because credit growth was consistently over 10%, and particularly in two periods, 95, 97, over 20% credit growth. In 2001, 2002, over 30% credit growth. These are massive speculative bubbles. Of course, again, 2007, very late in the game, with the American banking crisis already and British banking crisis already happening, credit growth is accelerating yet again, over 25% credit growth. What sort of monetary policy is this? This must create passive inflation and a bust banking system, but it also leads to overspending by the government. So what happens in these particular key periods, 93, 94, and again 2000, 2001, these two big boosts to credit creation, excess credit creation? Well, monetary policy is made by the Bank of Greece, which is privately owned joint stock company, which was established outside of Greece in 1928, or by the 1927 Geneva Protocol. In 1994 something happened. That's when the Bank of Greece was made quite independent from the government. It stopped lending money to the government. As of 1994, the Bank of Greece no longer provides finance in any form to the public sector. And the Bank of Greece also speaks of the prohibition of monetary financing. So it wasn't going to help the government anymore at all. That didn't slow credit creation, as some people might think, oh, they're getting more conservative. No, quite the contrary. Bank credit started to get out of hand. And second phase, 2000-2001, the Bank of Greece became fully independent from the government without any democratic accountability, and of course became the Greek branch of the ECB. The ECB itself, of course, is the most unaccountable and most independent central bank in the world, rivaling in history only the Reichsbank, which was previously the most disastrous central bank in history. The Reichsbank, the German central bank, before 1945. So the Great Greek Asset Bubble was created this period, 1994 to 2009, by the Greek Central Bank and ECB, who were in charge of bank credit creation. This led to increased tax revenues, which the politicians were happy about, and of course more positive economic growth projections, which you can understand, there's a boom. And of course it encouraged everyone to overspend and undersave. But it was clearly an unsustainable credit bubble that had to result in a banking crisis and a fiscal crisis, because the moment you slow credit creation from 20-30% growth down to only 5% growth or worse, you will of course get asset price falls because speculators go bankrupt, bad debts build up in the banking system, banks become risk-averse, banks start lending less, credit creation goes down further, the economy starts to slow, credit for real circulation slows, tax revenues go down, expenditure goes up, unemployment rises, the government has to spend more, receive less, fiscal deficits expand, total debt rises, fiscal and debt to GDP ratios deteriorate as both denominator and numerator get worse on both sides. So that's of course what happened in Greece. In terms of the responsibility, it's very clear the causes in terms of economic causation is monetary, and therefore the central bank, the ECB, have a lot to ask for, particularly these 2 periods of independence from the government and independence via being incorporated into the ECB. Now, that's how we got here. What are the solutions? Here's the solution we've been told by the ECB, which is the European Commission's central bank. Greece has to increase borrowing. And as Bill pointed out, well, hang on, isn't debt, national debt, too much debt, a problem? And they're telling us to borrow some more. Well, this is also known as the loan shark solution. You've got too much debt, you're in trouble. Well, I can help you. I'll lend you more. I'll there be interest to pay? You have to mortgage the last few assets that are not mortgaged yet. You still own a house, don't you? That's why I'm going to help you. This is how millions of Americans have thrown out of their house in the last few years. In America, evicted. Because what are these subprime loans? Subprime loans are loan shark loans, whereby people were identified that still had a few assets that could be seized. Yes, the interest payments were huge, building up debt that couldn't be paid back and wasn't paid back. So are the banks losing? No. The money was created out of nothing. They knew they would never get back the entire amount with accumulated interest on interest. But they had the collateral and they seized it. People had to leave their homes. That's of course an age-old Baptist trick. That's been played for at least 2,000 years. We have records for that. Now, Greece is being told other solutions. Increase the debt, but also you've got to tighten belts now. Some fiscal spending cuts, welfare cuts. See, you've got no money, you've been overspending, you haven't been working hard enough. That's what they're saying. So, we will help you if you further give up sovereignty, transfer control to players outside Greece, particularly the EU and its institutions such as the ESM, which is a proto-European finance ministry. Other options such as exiting from the euro or default, they're taboo. If you do that, really bad things will happen to you. Threats are being uttered like to the Icelandic people. The funny thing is this package of alleged solutions doesn't include anything that would tackle the problem that everyone is facing in Greece. There's no growth. The economy is shrinking. Unemployment is rising. Youth unemployment is, this is criminal what's been happening here in Greece due to policies imposed on Greece. No policies to stimulate growth. How can that be the solution? Of course, we know from the quantity theory of credit what the solution is to stimulate growth. Growth is a function of credit creation for GDP transactions. What's been happening on that count? Well, look again at this chart of bank lending. Credit in Greece, latest data, minus 7%. Well, now you know what you're going to get in the next half year or 9 months. Further contraction in the economy. Credit, econometric system is reducing the money supply. And so, of course, there will be fewer transactions. The whole national income pie is shrinking. The irony is that even if you now were to say, we'll change government, forget about the pressures, we'll just increase spending. This is what Japan did. In this situation, fiscal expansion with credit creation shrinking alone also will actually not help. That's how bad it is. Because the income pie is restricted by credit creation shrinking. You now increase the government share of this pie, you must reduce the private sector share. What you need is you have to increase the entire pie. That can only happen by expanding money circulating in the economy, credit creation for GDP transactions. Well, you all know that's the good news. But it's a sad picture, of course, for many countries in Europe. Credit creation is shrinking in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy. And remember, Ireland and Portugal are the poster boys of doing exactly what Brussels is telling them. Look at it, minus 6.6% credit growth in Portugal, similar to Greece. And Ireland, minus 17%. The Irish economy has been imploding. Well, there is a real solution. And of course, as I mentioned, yes, exit from the euro is a solution. Defaulting, starting again with your own currency. I'll come back to that. Because there's actually something we can do immediately now. If we can convince the finance ministry, even within the current institutions, within the rules of the EU and ECB, there is something the finance ministry can do to create a recovery for sure within 6 to 9 months' time. Tax revenues rising, the economy expanding rapidly, employment rising is possible. They don't need to have a vote in government, we don't need a revolution for this. So there is a small, simple policy that I recommend to be implemented immediately while we talk about the bigger changes needed at the same time. This policy proposal would not cost any extra money. It will solve the funding problem in the bond markets where yields are very high. We would not need to give up any sovereignty to the EU. There wouldn't be any extra costs. And this has to do with expanding credit creation. It's a part and parcel of the policies suggested in 1994 in Japan, which I called quantitative easing, or Yote Kinyu Kanra. Sadly, this expression, well, central banks love this expression. First few years they were saying, oh, this, what Werner says can't be right. But then they started to like this expression, Bank of Japan and Bank of England started to use it, but they defined it wrongly. The real definition of this expression is to expand credit creation for GDP transactions. Well, now you know why we need a shorter term for this expression, like quantitative easing. You increase total effective purchasing power. How can you do that? Well, here's what Greece should do, what the finance ministry can do. In fact, you don't even need the finance minister for this. We just need to convince the head of the debt management office, part of the finance ministry, to switch, very technical small thing, switch the funding of the government finance, public sector borrowing. Just enhanced debt management, I would call it. And of course the same applies to countries in Europe like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, but also Japan. In fact, even Germany and the UK would benefit from this. All these governments need to save money, reduce borrowing costs, and at the same time we need a policy that stimulates growth. So far, the proposals mentioned by Brussels do not stimulate the economy, they don't increase credit creation. And here's how it can be achieved. Remember how it all started? It started in the bond market. The bond market vigilante speculators started to short Greek government bonds, driving yields up. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. You could make lots of money shorting Greek bonds. What before was a sure conversion trade became the divergence trade, but at the cost to the Greek taxpayer. So a lot of money flowing from Greece to the speculators. does the Greek government borrow in the bond market? They surely haven't been kind to Greece. Ditto for Spain, Portugal, Ireland. Don't borrow in the bond market. It's a much better, cleverer way to borrow the money, which will solve all the other problems as well. Borrow the money from the creator of the money supply. Oh, you mean the ECB? We can't do that according to European rules. Well, no, I don't mean the ECB. They only create, and it's Greek branch, they only create together 3% of the money supply. Borrow from those who create money when they lend, banks, the Greek banks. So what the government needs to do is to say, well, we're not going to borrow double-digit interest rates expensively in the bond market. We won't issue bonds. So what do we do when the old bonds become mature? We need to roll over debt. You go to all the Greek banks and you borrow the money from the Greek banks at their prime rate, which is very low. It's around 3%, not 20%, 15% as in the bond market. 3%. Well, hang on. Don't the banks, can the banks do that? They don't have the money. You're right, they don't have the money. That's why you need to borrow from them. That will allow them to create the money out of nothing. That's how banking works. That's what usually finance ministry officials don't understand, but we can tell them. So when you do this, the banks will create money, and it's according to the Basel Bank regulations, according to which lending to the government has a zero risk weight. So according to the Basel capital adequacy rules, they don't need any capital. They are allowed to create the money out of nothing, lend to the government. And these are loan contracts, not tradable securities. Therefore, they don't have to be marked to market. They can't be marked to market. Therefore, the banks will love this. So far when they bought government bonds, it hurt the banks. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, another downgrade, bond prices fall. The banks are hurt. Banks are affected. Banks are going to be bailed out. The government has to inject money into the banks. Government finances get worse. It's a downward spiral. Cut through this. The government borrows from banks through loan contracts. They stay at face value, say 100, on the books of the banks all the time. They're not traded. They can't be attacked by speculators. These downgrades, Standard & Poor's downgrades, irrelevant. And it's according to all the rules of Basel and the ECB. And the ECB, as it was said, it will accept this as collateral if needed. And so the banks will create this money, which will circulate in Greece, expand the money supply, lead to demand, and the economy will expand because you are increasing the money supply. Credit creation will move from -7 to +3%, and you get positive economic growth, employment, and tax revenues will rise. So instead of governments giving money to banks, which has been happening, not very efficient, crazy, banks should give money to governments, because that's the system we have at the moment where banks create money supply. Now in Japan, I told them in the early 90s to do this, but they refused. They issued money, they borrowed money from the bond markets, issued bonds. So whenever you get a fiscal stimulus like here, Ministry of Finance spends money, construction, expenditure, they issued bonds, which means that spending on one side, but you take the money out of the economy through bond issuance, ±0. The money supply doesn't increase. Zero net impact, which I've shown econometrically very precisely. So instead, when the government borrows from the creators of the money supply, that's the system we have at the moment, you are increasing the money supply through credit creation. The net effect is 100% of fiscal expenditure, fully monetized. You will expand the income pie in the economy. It's very simple. And I've mentioned many of these advantages. Of course, the simplest one to sell this to Ministry of Finance officials, debt management office officials is, well, do you really want to pay 15% on the bond yields? Or even 8%, or whatever good deal you might get? Well, the banks will lend to you at 3% voluntarily. They'll be happy to do it. These are the data showing the bond yields, the green line 5-year, the red line 10-year government bond yields. And the blue line is the prime rate. That's the best interest rate banks lend out to their best customers. And that's always below 4%. This is the peak of the crisis, July 2012, Portugal. Why does the government in Portugal borrow from the bond market at 12% when it can borrow from the banks at 3.8%? Spain, close to 7% in the bond market, 2.7% borrowing from banks. Greece, well, anything between 15 and 60% recently, when they can borrow at 3% from the banks. Well, I tell you, there's some people out there who really don't like it, and they've been arguing against this, and they've told government officials, oh, there's some dangerous ideas out there. You know who they are? Well, who earns money when governments raise money through bond issuance? Well, there's firms out there called Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, usually names like that, even when it happens in Greece. They're the biggest underwriters. They help governments distribute the bonds that they have to issue. It's a tough job. Actually, marginal cost goes to zero. It's established channels to pass them on to institutional investors. They get 1%, even 2% for this job. We're really raising 10 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion. 2%, soon we're talking money. So clearly they have no interest in losing those commissions, because my proposal would also save that commission. No need. Of course, there are other solutions, and I will just quickly mention them and then wrap up. I emphasize this one because please do go out, tell the Finance Ministry, tell the Prime Minister, tell the Finance Minister, but also any official at the Finance Ministry. I've started to make contact, but why don't you do that? It doesn't make any sense to do what they're doing. But there's other solutions. For example, when banks have bad debts, we can get rid of those at zero cost. Usually, there's international pressure to use tax money, to use your money to bail out banks. That's the most costly. That's a way of increasing debt. It's a way of increasing the extraction of money from the economy, from you, to the bondholders. But there's no need to pay for that. It has been done before by the Bank of England in 1914, the Bank of Japan in 1945. All you need to do is balance sheet 100 for loans, but they're worth only 20. So the vast equity is less than 10. We don't want to use tax money. The central bank can buy those non-performing loans at face value, at 100. The bank balance sheets are immediately restored entirely. We've shifted the issue to the central bank, but it's more than a shift. That is a solution. It stays on the central bank balance sheet at 100, and that's where the story ends. There's no cost, no tax money used. Because of course the central bank doesn't have a loss of 80. If we were to record it properly, it would be a gain of 20. If you had a license to print money, any purchase is a gain. Isn't there cost inflation? No. No money is injected into the economy. We're just rejigging bookings within the financial sector, the banking sector. No money leaves the banking sector, inflation cannot happen. Of course, we also, as solutions, should make central banks accountable to parliaments. That was a lesson from the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank in Germany was, in post-war Germany, was a successful central bank. And this lesson has been greatly misunderstood. Usually it's said, oh, the central bank was made independent, therefore it was successful. The truth could not be further from it. It's the entire opposite. The lesson from German history was, when the predecessor of the Bundesbank, the Reichsbank, was made in 1924 independent from the government, and independent and unaccountable to any democratic institution, any institution inside Germany. It was above the law, outside any German control. That led to disaster. Therefore, the innovation, the lesson, when the Bundesbank was created after the wars, we have to make the central bank less independent, to make it more established, they were telling us, oh, we have to do it the same way as the Bundesbank, independence. Well, that wasn't the truth. So the ECB was the introduction of the revival of the Reichsbank, because that's its same legal status. It's unaccountable to any democratically elected assembly, the ECB. And so all the lessons from the Bundesbank were unlearned with the ECB. The other policy that we need, of course, is while we have the current system where banks create the money supply, there needs to be close monitoring and guidance of bank credit and its allocation. It should be only for productive purposes, and we get growth and no inflation. And harmful speculative credit creation should be banned. That is possible. This is the secret, if you're interested, of the high growth economic miracle in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China. Credit guidance, a system of credit guidance targeting productive purposes, restricting speculative credit. Another solution is, while we have the current system where banks create money, you don't like credit guidance, you want the markets to decide, well, there is another way, and that is you change your banking system. Germany wasn't affected by the financial crisis largely because its banking system consists to 70% of not-for-profit banks, local small banks, public savings banks, and cooperative credit union banks, Sparkassen and Volksbank, 70% of the banking system. In the UK, it's the other way around. What in Germany is 12%, the high street banks, big banks, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank. In Britain, it's 95%. And of course, that's a disaster because they're the ones that lend to speculation. Local small banks lend to local economies, and it's like having your own central bank. They create money by creating credit. This is the way with the current system you can make it work for local communities and therefore for the whole country. Because the harmful speculative credit creation hardly takes place in a system of small local banks. There's 2,000 of these local banks in Germany, and they can't lend to speculators, they're too small. And they don't want to. They lend to small and medium-sized enterprises and individuals. But of course, the final solution, and I don't have to talk much about it because Bill and also Professor Duber has already talked about it, is to change the system. Do we actually need this system where banks create the money supply? That is a public privilege that should be returned to those who belong to the people, us. And that has been successful whenever it happened. Just a few examples. Of course, the first paper money was in China in the 10th century, and that was state money, not issued by private banks, not even issued by a central bank. This is why I'm more cautious about central bank money. I prefer the money to be issued directly by the state, because we know from history, when there's a separate institution from the government, even if it's nationally owned, or maybe they'll privatize it in 20 years, right? But if the finance ministry issues money, it's kind of harder to argue that we should privatize the finance ministry. So government money was successful in China. When Marco Polo, please read his book, it's fantastic. It's the greatest description of the first open market operations of a government-controlled central bank, or treasury ministry central bank. And he describes his time as advisor to Kublai Khan, the emperor of China and of the Mongolian Empire, biggest empire in the world at the time. So if you ask Kublai Khan, how big is your national debt? He wouldn't have understood what you're talking about. And that's good because you can keep your head on if he doesn't understand his geography. If you're actually suggesting to him that he should borrow money, he would have understood that he can't be the sovereign ruler if he has to borrow money, because it's already said in the Old Testament, in the Bible, Proverbs 22:7 says, the borrower is servant to the lender. And I'm sure if you actually suggested to Kublai Khan to borrow money on interest, you wouldn't have left the room with your head on. So other states have done it. Japan issued paper money, state money, 1868. You can imagine how quickly the banking dynasties rushed to Tokyo to advise the Japanese to stop silly ideas like that and establish a partly privately owned central bank. So a few years later, the stock, the Bank of Japan, was created. The colonies in North America issued state money and did very well until Benjamin Franklin explained it slightly too frankly to the British colonial rulers how it worked. They lobbied to ban state money, and the colonies moved into recession, which led to the War of Independence. But the idea was out there in America. Lincoln introduced state money, and of course, also later there were United States notes. This bill also alluded to, but also in Germany. Here you see, this is 5 marks, Reichskassenschein, German state money, issued in 1904 based on the law of 1874. You see again, the bankers were rushing to Berlin to advise the government. This is the idea of state money. You should borrow from us. So 1876, the Reichsbank was founded, and this is one of the last generations of these state money notes. Of course, they stopped to exist a few years later, and we go back. But the idea was still going around. So in Britain, during the First World War, also state money was issued by the Treasury. So this is a pound note issued by the Treasury, not the Bank of England. It can be done, because nowadays we can have digital money, we don't need paper money, as Bill and Professor Hoover have explained. There's a few more examples here, but I think I'll leave it at that. If you're interested in finding out more, there's a book on the economics of credit creation, New Paradigm in Macroeconomics, Power Millions and the book on the money creation process itself. That's just a very thin book. Where does money come from? Explaining the system to the layman as well. There's another book of interest in the political economy of how central banks work behind the scenes, usually for political aims, not for central banking aims. Read Princes of the Yen, 2003. Well, thank you very much.
Now we will, I'd like to present the fourth speaker, Mr. Brewer, who's an activist, as active central bank shareholder and CEO of Community Manufacturer AG. I hope you don't mind I called you an activist as well.
That's what you need to do to change the system.
Okay, and he will give us a talk on practical monetary reform experience and insights for a possible Greek solution.
Until technique works, thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope that I also can talk a little bit about economic history. I don't go so far back like my colleague Mr. Werner, but I take the young history and what impact it would have for the future.
As an economic historian with all these references that we made, I want to apologize for calling you professor before. I have made this mistake twice tonight. But I think you should embrace non-academic form. And I think we're doing this here today.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to give the Greek population some insight of what I learned out of my practical experience of trying to change the world and introduce monetary reform. I will bring 2 examples of 2 countries, but I learned talking to all the people and having interviews with the press and also with the TV that I first of all want to explain what money is, because we are revolving always around the money theme, and I thought that it's more see on the back of the euro notes, you see a letter, and then you see the numbers. I have a Y, that's for Greece, okay? And when you turn it around on the front face, you have some features which show you who printed the banknote. Now, this one is actually printed with the Bank of Greece, which is the N in the star, and it's actually the 26th printing plate for 10 euro notes. And then there are a few more features. Now, this is money. The Greek Central Bank, the Bank of Greece, is allowed to produce 2.8%, that's the quote of the Greek Central Bank, of the whole cash, of the whole banknotes which are legal tender. By December 2012, the latest figure released just a few days ago, the European Central Bank released 915 billion euros in banknotes. That means when you look at the balance sheet of the Bank of Greece, which was released on Monday, published on Tuesday, just a few days ago, you see that we have in Greece roughly 25 billion euros in banknotes. The coins are a separate issue because the coins are issued actually by the Treasury. In Greece now they are issued by the Bank of Greece, by the Central Bank, but they are not a legal tender in Greece like in many other EU 17 countries. That means that is money, for me, is my first definition. That's the cash. That's very limited. Then we have the M1, which is actually our checking accounts where we pay our electronic payments normally, our rent and whatever. Then monetary aggregate M1, the whole European EU 17, the Euro system, it's 5,100 billion by the year end. Now we see the difference between what people think is money and what is money. We compare now 950 billion, which is actually what you physically use when you go to the ATM, to 5,100 billion, which is actually in our means of payment accounts. Then you have the bigger picture with the monetary aggregate M2, which is actually our savings accounts and also money market funds. That is 9,000 billion in the 17 countries which comprise the euro area. And then the biggest amount is with a little bit more for repo business and other stuff. It's 9,800 billion. That is the whole amount of money which we use. That's roughly in aggregate the same amount as the GDP of those 17 countries. Okay? Just to put a little bit perspective to those numbers. I just want to make this introduction before I start my thing because I think it's very helpful to get it a little bit nailed down and it comes back in my presentation also. For today's discussion, I used one of Gandhi's, that thing first. They ignore you, then they ridicule you or laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. That's describing the stage of the winning stage of nonviolent activism. It was always, I always thought this from Gandhi, and I tried to find the original quote, but it actually looks like it's a disputed statement of Gandhi. But I like it very much because it applies very much to our money reform movement. First, nobody looked at us and ignored us. Then they laughed at us, there's just some nutters and some cracks. And then at some stage they fight you. You will see in my presentation I am at the fighting stage. And then you will win. Okay? Now what's the future of money and this transformation? Let's start with history. Irving Fisher produced this book, 100% Money, in 1935. And he didn't produce it on his own. There were renowned, distinguished professors from various universities in America, and Irving Fisher was a presidential advisor to various US presidents. And this was actually his second last book he wrote, his, so to speak, summary of his lifetime experience. And he put everything together which helped to understand what problem we have in the fractional reserve banking system and how we could solve it. And he said we can create safe money, we can smooth the business cycles, and we can control inflation. We get the seigniorage in the public purse, and the public debt is redeemed. The seigniorage, again, on this note. The biggest banknote in the euro area, 500 euro note, costs physically in the production with the paper, high quality, with the stripes, and with all security features, 60 cents. That's, for instance, the price from Easy and Adrian. I mean, the Bank of Greece is maybe a few cents cheaper. The 10 euro note is also cheaper. But in this case, when you take a 500 euro note, the biggest denomination, 499 euro and 40 cents are sailorage. That is actually what the central bank, printing this piece of paper and issuing it as currency, is making as profit. Now, normally, in most countries of the world, in roughly 180 countries, the central banks are owned by the state and by the treasury. Now we have a special feature here in Greece, as we have in South Africa, which is my next example, because actually the central bank, the Bank of Greece, is a public entity. It's owned by several thousand shareholders. It's listed on the Athens Stock Exchange, and I come to this later, back to this point later, because that's actually one point of a short-term activism, how you can put pressure on the state and maybe change something. But this history and all the academic background, which was created in 1935 and later on, and Professor Huber and Professor Werner and everybody contributed, and we have all the same theme with slight variations, is that it needs some adjustment for the 21st century, for the electronic money. Because you have to go back in 1935, there was a bigger percentage, there was roughly 20-30% depending on what country, or even higher, was actually physical cash. And only later on, more and more electronic money came into place. Now, one possibility is my model, which I created for South Africa, which is called Just Money. And when you look at the bubbles, this blue one at the back, at the top, that's actually the central bank money. That's actually what I show you, the cash plus the deposits of the commercial banks with the central bank, which is actually also legal tender, because whatever the commercial banks deposit with the central bank, they can demand it being paid out in paper. Okay, that's the smallest bubble. The bigger bubble is actually the gray one in the middle, which is the commercial bank money, which is the debt-created money, which in our case now is over 90% of the money we think is money is being created by giving somebody a loan. The debt money, okay? Created by the commercial banks to the benefit of the commercial banks, and they actually profit on the sailorage. Because, I mean, this at least costs a few cents, but the electronic entry into a bank account is even cheaper. That means that has a full sailorage. Now, what my model tries is like Professor Huber's, that we increase this bubble of the central bank money over this big bubble of the current money and safeguard the monetary equity and one that is that we safeguard your checking account, that you can pay your mortgage, that you can pay your electricity and your phone and your cell phone. Now, this is called in my model Just Money. Now, how did I get to this? I mean, I'm a central bank shareholder since, as you see, that's the share certificate, since 2006, and my recommendation out of my experiences, get a share yourself in the central bank, not in South Africa, in your Greek central bank, I come to later, and have your say. I use this leverage in this only 100% privately owned central bank in the world, which is actually also a G20 country, to get to the points which I come to. What can you do as an activist shareholder? I mean, it says that this is now out of the Amendment Act, which they did against me in South Africa in 2010 to actually try to speed up the process, to the need to give urgent attention to potential destabilization of the bank by certain shareholders, and to stop South African Reserve Bank shareholders from circumventing. That means when you use your rights accordingly and properly within the law, you have quite a leverage when you put your fulcrum and your weight to the right point. Now, a little bit of history again. I used the current money of its history. In the 19th century, actually, we nationalized the coins, or the monarchs and the royal families. In the 20th century, we nationalized the banknotes, because until then, every commercial bank issued its own paper money. And now, then we said, okay, we introduce central banks who issue the currency. And now we are in the 21st century, and we have to nationalize electronic money. That means we come from the closest aggregate, which now, in the euro area, the coins comprise 23 billion. For 17 countries, we have 23 billion euro worth of coins. Through the 20th century, we have 950 billion in terms of banknotes. And I say we don't nationalize now the whole bubble, which you saw before, of 9,800 billion, the whole money every year, but we only nationalize M1, that our money, which we need to pay our bills, is safe. Now, why do we get this? Declare the money supply M1 as the means of payment as a sole legal tender. Let's look at the Bundesbank. That's the latest act from 2011. The systemic risk today is that only banknotes are the sole unrestricted legal tender. That's the official law in Germany, like in all other countries. Now, what is legal tender? Legal tender is normally the piece of paper with which you pay your taxes. Now, when you would go with a bundle of cash to the tax authority in Germany, you would get a special audit, and they don't even accept it because they want electronic means. It means I had this issue last year with the German Minister of Finance in the exchange and said, explain to me how this works. And they were very rude and said, actually, when you are interested in cash, you have to hide something. Now, I can only say to you guys, try it with your own, and try it with your own Ministry of Finance, try it with the Prime Minister, and see what reactions they have. That's also activism. Okay, my first practical experience. As I'm shareholder since 2006, I tried to see what's happening there and learn a lot over the years. And then finally, in December 2009, I was invited by the President, which is comparable to your Prime Minister and your President together, because he is not only ceremonial, he is also the Prime Minister. And his mentions, and he wanted to know what was going on and what can we do. I told him that just money system, the money reform in South Africa, how we introduce it, along the lines of Professor Hugo Spolgel and all the other issues, along the lines of urban officials 100% money, adapted to the South African standards. And it would only have required to put 2 additional words with an amendment into the current act to actually safeguard 100% minimum reserve requirement. That means all the money on the checking accounts will be safe. And in the future, the state will issue its own money net interest free. That means with the lifetime of the loans being paid back, new money will be phased in from the state net interest free, that you keep your level of money supply in an equilibrium, then you don't have any depression. Now, in South Africa, there would have been a special issue that you wouldn't have even needed a monetative, which Professor Huber advertises as the fourth power, because I think that the fourth power in some countries is not so easy to put into the constitution, because you need a 2/3 or 3/4 majority. Now, this would have been a very easy issue to actually get, on the one side, the state to understand what's going on and help them. But what happened? After I had an agreement with the President, a few weeks later, the hell break loose on me. The media came, I got slandered, I got slashed, and there are a few quotes, breaking the bank, the Banknotenjäger, left zeros in on reserve bank, and then the unions came that we nationalize and socialize, nationalize and Marcus, that's the governor, and that is actually part of my lesson. I learned what I can contribute to a Greek solution, because I know how the systems work and how the system works and how they fight back. Now, my next approach was exactly 1 year ago. I was invited by the man on the left-hand side, is the Vice President, more or less the Prime Minister of the Seychelles, David Vaughan. He is, at the time, he was also Vice President, and the Minister of Finance, and the man on the right is Pierre Laporte, who was a governor at the time when I was in the Seychelles, and now is the Minister of Finance. They invited me over and to go through the technical issues, how to do it. I thought it's a great case because it's an isolated island, 100,000 people, and we could actually achieve a deal. But I got slashed by the IMF and the Paris Club Agreement, because in April 2009 they got a debt relief of 45% by the Paris Club, which is an unofficial body of nations. And now they have to report twice a year to the IMF and are under strict austerity programs to the the way that they now need to even import their beef frozen chicken from Thailand before they were self-sufficient. That's the part of the IMF results. Now, I think that the paper which then came out in August 2012, maybe or maybe not, is connected to the thing which I did in Seychelles, because a week after I left the Seychelles, the delegation from the IMF came and got them again back on track. I think that this Chicago paper, which has been issued as maybe a false flag operation to just confuse us all, but for me, I think that we need to fight for the case that we need to make the people understand, inform and get the message out, and I'm very thankful to those two documentaries. I saw that Democracy had more than 2 million viewers. It's an excellent documentary, and I think that everybody a few years saw it. And the following one last year was the Perestroika, and I hope that we make a documentary 2013 about 100% money or whatever it's called. Now, what's a possible transformation? One transformation is the bank run, which nobody wants, but actually it's maybe necessary at some stage. Okay, now the formatting here went through the PowerPoint because I made it in an open office, but it doesn't matter. The problems of the current full fractional reserve banking system. In the EU, we only have 1% minimum reserve requirement. That means the banks only need €1 to lend to make a loan for €100. Now, this only applies actually to half of the balance sheet, and actually we only need half a cent. It means we need 50 cents to lend out €100, but the banks charge €100 interest for 99.5 €, which they don't even have themselves. That is not really the right way to do it, I think. The next thing that the deposit insurance systems are with, I can tell you they're even a lie. They didn't work in Germany in the Herstatt case in the 70s. They didn't work with Commerzbank and the Dresdner Bank, where they had to create an extra institution called SOFIC to bail them out. And the next point is, the next puzzle piece is, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when a bank run stops. Once it's on, you can't stop it. And the current proposal, I don't know how much you follow the Greek current proposal. The Ministry of Finance tries to reduce the cash payments to €500 maximum this year. I mean, they're not as strict as Italians, because Italians actually introduced by 1st of January next year €50. It means that 100, 200, €500 are not a legal tender in Italy next year anymore. Those steps are part of the system to safeguard the bank run. And the next plan on the Ministry of Finance, the Deputy Minister just declared a few days ago, the Ministry of Finance plans to incentivize electronic payments in Greece in 2030. That means they want to actually give you some credits, whatever brownie points they give you, then you use your electronic money, then you don't go back to this, because that is the devil for them. Because when all of you guys go to the bank at the same time, the bank run is down. Now to show you this, the latest figures, bank in circulation, Bank of Greece, 23.5 billion. The Greek population is maybe only 3 million. I mean, the various census of different data. It gives you roughly €2,000 per citizen. Now, it's difficult to establish how much money is really available. There's only two institutions in the ECB who make surveys and studies about it. It's the Bundesbank and the Austrian National Bank. Austrian National Bank since 2007 semi-annually makes a survey what's happening with the cash, and the Bundesbank made in-depth studies in 2009 and 2000. Given time, only 10 to 15% of this amount of cash, which would theoretically be available, is physically available. It means we end up with 210 to 350 euros per person in Greece. So that's now the problem they have, because they want everybody, when everybody goes at the same time to the same ATM, you make a Twitter ambush, I mean, you quickly start some bank run. I mean, that's actually what they're really afraid of, because out of a bank run comes a bank panic when various commercial banks run. Now that this is not ridiculous, shows the Financial Times. I mean, that's a column of the Financial Times. The only way to stop a Eurozone bank run, case for a block-wide deposit insurance and bank run resolution regime. Now, I don't read the article. It's just the quintessence is that actually you can't stop it, and we don't have a proper insurance scheme, because you would need to actually have a banking unit, a proper supervision which we don't have. And therefore comes the quote quite handy from Sir Mervyn King from the Governor of Bank of England. It may be not rational to start a bank run, but it is rational to participate in one, because then you want to also get some of the cash. Now, what's happening in Greece now? We have national, in my view, you should try to find a nationalized legal tender creation, and additionally also allow the freedom of new currencies. I didn't explain before in my chart with just money. The bottom and the bubble at the bottom was the barter, local exchange transaction system, electronic money, community currencies, alternative currencies, Bitcoin, however you coin it, however you name it. You only can make a money reform in the way that you nationalize the money that is saved for payment, and on the other hand also allow the markets to develop a system which works for the country. That's to give free. It's not like denationalization of money like I asked for it, but on the one hand, nationalize legal tender creation that the state gets the sailorage, and on the other hand, allow the market to develop the right system for the right country. Can be a metal-based, can be a gold-based system, can be a whatever. Now, so far we have nationalization of toxic and problem assets and bad banks, and I think the sell-by date of those solutions expired. Then we have to create nationalization of the creation of money with a simultaneous introduction for free alternative complementary currencies, and that's the only way forward. And I think that local markets will determine the best solution to fit the Greek society and economy. And the monetary diversity is the name of the game. The variety is healthier than the monoculture. Now, how can we get another angle on this? We use the odious debt situation. We copy the Ecuadorian Korea style, or we create a new Greek style. I mean, that's not your former Minister of Finance. I speak about the one 100 years ago, just to not confuse the Greek public. Odious debt, what's odious debt? I would like to bring it back from debtocracy to democracy. And the odious debt situation, or definition, is when it's done without the knowledge and the approval of the people, for when it's done not for the benefit of the people, and when the lender knows about it. I think this applies to most of the debt which Greek got in the recent times, especially when you think about what's happened now. You got 6 frigates from France for 2.5 billion. You got helicopters for 3 billion from France. You got 6 submarines from Germany for 1 billion. I think that is all part of the game. How do you prove the illegality and illegitimacy of most of the debt and prove that it's odious? You create an audit committee. I think that the two documentaries I quoted before are a very good summary, and I think that's a part of the thing you can do to spread the word, to get it out, to inform more people, and one can really learn from Argentina or Ecuador. And otherwise, I can only say this Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund, it's another plundering of the state in my view. I have nothing in common with Merkel. I mean, I'm Bavarian, I don't like Berlin, I don't like what she's doing. I'm against Machiavelli, and I'm also against the task force which Mr. Reichenbach is the leader, and what he's doing. I think you need to resist as people in Greece against those undemocratic and really scrupulous things. The Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund is a special thing which I don't like, because it's actually a blueprint of the German Treuhand, which we had with the reunification of Germany. They copied the whole model, and actually it's a disaster. We started with 175 billion in debt 22 years ago. We still have 30% of it. That's now Germany. We still have 30% of the debt which we got in 1990. Although we got rid of it with a third with the payments which we got for licenses for the cell phone licenses. Okay, I think for the transition, it only can be achieved through the leverage in the fulcrum. That means where do you put your point and where do you put your weight that you achieve it. Now, what can you do in Greece alternatively? You can create alternative complementary currencies. They are blessed for Greece. Now, one example I chose is the lira currency. It's based on the JAK from Denmark, which is also now in Finland, Spain, Sweden, and Italy, and other countries. And the weird Swiss solution is very interesting because it's a cooperative. And they went through all the phases. One just needs to learn from them, and you can create an alternative currency in no time. They have also since 2004 their own currency code. Not many people know, and Switzerland is not like a guinea pig country. I mean, this thing is old, and it's existing since 1934, and it's working, and they have their own system. And I think it got implemented very quickly in Greece. At least you have, out of the 30 Greek banks, 12 are cooperative banks. It means there's big space for immediate implementation. And it's one of the models for an electronic water system, or however you call it, for those complementary currencies. Now comes my last and the quickest solution. Sorry about the formatting again. It's due to the other program. The Bank of Greece. Takeover, liquidation. That's quite a provocative statement maybe for you, but I learned out of discussions now that not many people know that the Bank of Greece is actually a public company. I mean, since its inception in the 20s, it's listed on the Athens Stock Exchange. It has, when one released the figures of the Central Bank of the Bank of Greece, 19,000 shareholders, and the Hellenic Republic has 9% share ownership. They're restricted to 35% of the state by the statutes. I mean, it's a good read. Just go on the internet, Bank of Greece, go through the shareholder side, look at it, and it gives you a few ideas how you can create bottom-up activism with the big leverage, and at the right fulcrum also change the system. The takeover liquidation of the Bank of Greece is maybe theoretical, but I learned out of my South African experience that actually you can achieve a lot, and you can make a lot of noise, and you can get even acts being created against you, and for whatever other reason. How does it work? You need 75 shares nowadays to get one vote, then you can have a say. It will currently cost €1,300. It's not wasted money. The AGM of the Bank of Greece is now held on February 25th, and when you have your shares registered 5 days before, then you can turn up and have your say. It's only restricted to Greek citizens. It means we foreigners can't do anything. The Greeks need to do it. And I can tell you out of my own experience in South Africa, it's a life-changing practical experience, and you gain first-hand experience and insights of how the whole thing works. And the best of all, when you look at the figures of the Athens Stock Exchange, you would have made 35% profit in the shares over 1 month. As the Greek state, in my view, is buying the shares. One step for a Greek monetary reform revolution is getting a POG shareholder and getting involved. Now, how does this look? This is now the annual report which they issued on Tuesday. Annual report, you can't call it, it's a statement. I just took out a few positions to sorry, that it's too small. The first position is on the left-hand side is the assets, right-hand side are liabilities. The first position on the left-hand side is the gold receivables. The Greek Central Bank has 150 tons of gold. There's a misconception in the public also. People are talking about, let's take the gold of the Greeks and then we get some collateral. It doesn't work. The same with the gold of the Italians. It's also in the central bank, and it's owned. In Italy, the central bank is owned by the commercial banks. The fact is that as the Bank of Greece is a public company, the state can't access this gold. They just can't take out the gold, so to speak. It's a big leverage because this 5.9 billion there is roughly €300 a share in terms of value. Then you see that the capital reserves on the liability side are 815 million. That's more than enough to cover the current share price. The current share price is maybe 40% of the equity alone in reserves. Now, the difficult thing is you can't take it over anymore because they were clever last April. They introduced the lifespan of the central bank from 2020, when it would have been over, to 2050. They increased another 30 years because the Greek state knew that this could be a problem when they don't prolong the lifetime of the Bank of Greece. Now, For liquidation, you would have to wait maybe until 2050. But in the case of liquidation, the Bank of Greece, half of the money, half of the net asset value is going to the shareholder and half is going to the state. That would be a big gain we could have. That means a takeover is not possible anymore, technically, because it needs to wait so long. There's a voting restriction of 2% on a single party. That means you would need a lot of people who can buy up to 2% and then get them joined and you can do something. And the liquidation is also difficult. But you have a say, you can do something. Now it's the end of my discussion today, my conclusions. I use this blue with the smileys on the side because I'm from Bavaria and I don't know how much you know about that we stand for the first thing in 1822. And at this time, in your flag, you have also the Bavarian crown, and you had a lighter blue than you have today. So much about history. I hope that I made you happy with my history.
Yes.
And to sum up the whole thing, 100% of my just money will replace the fractional reserve banking system. I'm pretty sure. Alternative currency will be allowed unconditional. They have to. It doesn't make sense in my view. Nationalization of means of payment is a prerogative like coins and notes. It must be a physical. It must be a crime when you issue electronic money. Transformation is the most important issue, and I think the academic base is safe for a Folge, for a sound money, for positive money, or however you call it. We now just need to go into the implementation phase and the process management. The practical experience I gained, I would like to use to avoid further ambushes by the MFIs. MFIs is the term which the ECB used for monetary financial intermediaries. That's all the banks together. And then, how do we do the Greek transformation? I would say you maybe start a bank run, create a bank panic. That's very likely. But the other approach is that we go be an active shareholder and learn about the system and spread the word and get the system going. And I think that the Greek people have to take back the pride they deserve, get rid of their owner's debt, free themselves from the shackle of the current system, and create a debt and industry currency which can flow into the economy through public expenditure. And back to my beginning, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, which I experienced in South Africa, and then you win. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes more. I'd like to open the floor to questions, if there's any comments somebody wants to make. Actually, I was thinking of asking, how close are we to reforms? But I was thinking of this question before you came up here on the podium. So it's been a very fruitful evening. We've heard about the need for just money, proposals, theoretical advances on the quantity with the creation of the quantity theory of credit. We've heard about the need to create money and not debt. We've heard how the money system is at the root of the problem. And we've heard about the need to probably create a community of complementary currencies. And finally, we've heard about bottom-up activism. Well, I hope this meeting today in Athens, which is in a standstill and it's quite depressing and dark, may be a stepping stone for further collaborations and workshops on this topic. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the people who organized this and to the great ones who arrived here. Έχουμε το Skype. Ο κ. Μπραντασμίνη, πώς θα τα κρατήσει αυτό? Okay, we also have a presentation through Skype, so please stay. Yes, I can for myself. Yes, okay. Will the organizers please tell us how long the Skype will be? The university closes at 9. 20 minutes. Can we please ask the university to stay open? Fairness is a not clean. insieme.
Andiamo.
Andiamo insieme.
Beh, no.
So, we have 10 minutes to watch this, and then we have to rush out of the building, correct? I think the janitor is close to 9. We're not okay. I think this is fantastic. We'll have a slide presentation. So now we're going to listen to Professor Lita, excuse me to the expert for pronouncing Genomics is very correct. And he will talk to us about complementary currency solutions for Greece today. He's a research fellow at the Center for Sustainable Resources of the University of California at Berkeley. Are we connecting with Berkeley now or with Brussels? You know? Brussels, okay.
Greece is
only the third one that actually has the current sovereign debt problem. They have 286 countries with a banking crash. That is the banking crash last year. And we actually are not capitalists with like monetary instabilities, which are basically spreading, attacking the entire currency. And that's all. Some people are pretty well, and we worry about Europe itself. Every somewhere in the world where there's collapse, you would actually have thought about the systemic reserve. But because it's money, we're staying in the cost. And I think it's time to get out of that. Really time. And Greece, the Greek situation is dire enough that I believe that it's time to get out. Because otherwise the cost is justified. Now, how is that? I'm going to be dealing with two issues. What can the city in Greece do? What can the region do? Or what would the country do? But I actually prefer to recommend it at the city or regional level because it would actually be more adapted to the different circumstances of the different regions. And the second problem is how to create jobs in the current circumstances. Here is a simplified look on the systems approach. What we do with conventional money. We have on the left the competitive economy that's driven with national currency, or the case of Eurozone currency, which is created by bank debt, we explain actually tonight to you, and with which commercial transactions are happening. On the other side, we have the good debt, social capital, regional economy, cooperative or capital. How can we look at that situation? Well, we didn't think that actually normally help non-profits. And non-profits are then they want people to get tax reductions. On the other side, government get taxed and redistribute taxes and stuff. That's the way to make it happen. So is okay when the government get raised taxes and they're cracking things. What is the purpose of taxes? Yeah, I mean, we've heard 9 times that we're dealing with a currency created that is created out of nothing. Fiat created from bank debt. But the purpose of taxes, that perspective, is actually to give value to a currency that is really what's happening. If governments are not requiring taxes to be paid, euros in our economy, bank debt, nobody will bother these situations. So what I recommended is that city or regional governments require the taxes for the national currency on profits making, like they normally do. But actually issue currency and we want not permanently issue themselves without creating debt to others. And that they request the contribution, the state, would be taxes for that same process, require contribution in that terms that condition. This makes it possible to easy relaunch from a city level or from a regional level without being connected. And that currency, another currency, which is called citizen the banks happening in Africa, each every family each has a whole. So basically, we have a bank system fail. The currency is not electronic. If it's sold budget variation for a city spoken, for hopes, activities, social learning, labor, environmental, and so on. And they create a 70 companies, however, were NGOs playing the same role that businesses play in competitive economy. So that is an approach that financing. I would actually recommend, in order to make things simple, that instead of a recurrence, what was simply a ticket. Okay? And what you do, and the city required, the city would require 20 civics to be distributed the city, and the city itself that with whatever else happens. And because, so here's the mechanism that works. You would still have taxes, like in the day, if you have your income. We also require a contribution, in civics, in a person that's not, who has no interest. And now, let's assume that some firms are happy to work earn civics, and some others don't. Well, just like we do today, I have a word living, and I will come to the government. The government will stay on, right, sir? And they $50,000. They don't earn out. You could give it like $1 million worth of painting because I have for €1,000 debt. In fact, same applies here. So we create an open market, an eBay type, where the total transparency, where people don't have enough savings and then buy or whatever. They simply have to do it. That would solve the problem of cities or regions to deal with the whole range of issues that we currently have. You have the basic situation that the people who have the properties live in the city. They are not being hired because they're not in the work system, but the city can actually issue a civic and partner and pay these activities with civics, and thereby plan. Proposal is the commercial credit circuit. This is an approach that exists already, is operational. It's operational in Brazil, by today, and I will not that process of credit, and that's the reason why Greece will let me on. Now, we have to understand that the point is basically 80-90% of all private jobs are small and medium-sized businesses, precisely the businesses that are dying right now, leading to streets and fall in Greece. That is the thing. Now, why are they not surviving? The main problem is practically cash. That's not just you described.